Do you study theology? Do you study God? I would suspect that many of you would say, no, you don't. And in fairness to you, you have two perfectly good reasons for saying that. First is you would say, well, theology is like up there. I don't know that I could do that, because you're picturing big, thick books and crazy long sentences with big words in it. And you say, you know, that's not for me. Or maybe it's just I could do it, but I don't have the time to study those kind of things in depth. That's why they send people like me off to seminary, so that we can learn all that stuff. You had the time, I don't. You also might suggest that it's not practical, in the sense that the study of theology doesn't seem to affect your daily life or your daily faith, your daily devotions. Because also, too, you might have in your head this idea that theologians think about things like, can God make a rock bigger than he can lift? Which seems, and it is, very impractical. But I would like to suggest to you that both of those things are wrong. Theology, the study of God, is very practical, and it's very accessible to us. As an illustration of the practicality of it, if you study theology, if you study God, if you actually work at this a little bit, you would avoid the mistake that a middle-aged man made a couple years back, sat in my office and told me the story about how he had gotten fired from his job. And as he told me the story, he continued to point out to me that the reason he had gotten fired from his job was because this was God punishing him for all the things that he had done as a teenager. He thought that what God had done all those years ago is every time he did something awful, committed some grave sin, God had written it down. And God didn't do anything about it right then, but God was just thinking, oh, wait, just wait, I am going to get even for all of this. And then waited until the guy was reasonably successful, living a really good life, and then the shoe dropped. And as far as he was concerned, God got his paybacks. Hope you think that sounds silly, because it is. But maybe you have a slightly different view of that's not very good either. You start thinking about the judgment, and you picture yourself there again up in front of God, and God's got this big book. It's got all the things you've ever done wrong, and some of them are crossed out because you brought them up in confession, but not all, because you just forgot them or for whatever reason. And you tried that trick, if you will, at the end of confession saying, and for all the sins of my past, hoping that would wipe them all out. But it's all there in front of God, and he's looking at it, and he looks at you and says, really, this isn't working. And then maybe you picture Mary and Jesus come running in and saying, oh no, let her go, let them go. They did their best. And then God would say, oh, fine, and let you in. In other words, you have this sense that maybe God and Jesus are like good cop, bad cop. God is the judge. He wants justice. Jesus is, on the other hand, is so nice. Hope you think that's kind of silly too. Because it is. And then there is the one that really maybe most of us fall into. You know, the uncle that gets the invitation to come to a church wedding, and his response to this is, oh, I don't know. I mean, if I show up at church, God just might send lightning down and take care of me just as I walk in the doors. And we laugh at that. We think that's cute and funny. We should look at him and go, what are you talking about? God does not strike people with lightning. That's not God. But the fact that we laugh at it seems to indicate that somewhere in the back of our head, we just kind of think, well, maybe this is possible. Maybe that's what God does. So how is it that I know that all those things are wrong? I mean, like, seriously wrong. Well, I took a lesson in theology, not in seminary, but from the reading you just heard. I have a lot of sympathy for Philip. He's listened to Jesus say all these things like, I speak the words my Father gave me. I do the works of my Father. The Father and I are one. And Philip is probably speaking for the rest of the guys. They're just saying, hey, Jesus, I'm having a hard time with this Father thing. Show us the Father. And Jesus comes back with this terrific lesson in theology and says, oh, Philip, this is easy. If you've seen me, Jesus says, you've seen the Father. You want to know what God would do in a certain circumstance? Just look what I do in those circumstances. If you want to know what God would say to you in a given moment, just look at what I say to you in those kind of moments. If you've seen me, Jesus says, you've seen the Father. And that's how I know all that other stuff is ridiculous. Because I cannot think of a single story where Jesus, early in his ministry, was noticing bad stuff going on, writing it down, thinking, okay, I'll get even. And then later in the gospel you read where Jesus, does something to them. Jesus does not call down lightning. As a matter of fact, there's this I think it's a funny story where the disciples, they get rejected in a town and they come outside and they turn to Jesus and they say to him, hey, do you want us to call down fire from heaven to consume them? And Jesus looks at them and goes, no, I do not want to do that. We're just going to go to the next town. Jesus is just like God. And so if you think theology is hard, I don't know that it has to be. Sure, some parts are. There's no doubt about that. But if you want to take a big step in your understanding of God, in your study of God, just study Jesus. Because whatever Jesus is going to do, that's what God's going to do. And so if you're, worried about that judgment day, maybe you just might want to go back and think of the story of the woman caught in adultery. They bring this woman to her. That's a serious sin. Jesus certainly tells her not to do it again. He's not condoning this, but he forgives her. And if you read the story carefully, she did not even ask to be forgiven. Not directly, at least. If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. In times like this, I think there are just this tendency for people, you can certainly find this easily enough on the internet. There's this tendency for people to think, well, God is causing the pandemic as some sort of judgment on the United States or on the world or whatever. Having a hard time with that. I don't picture Jesus doing that. I don't know a story where Jesus, casts judgment, if you will, in that kind of way on the Romans or on the religious leaders of his day or any of it. Let's be careful about how we think of God. Because maybe the biggest reason you want to get this right is if you really think that God is out to get you, if you think that God is vengeful, if you think that God is just tolerating you, how will you ever get close to a God like that? You'll show up to Mass and you'll just go through the motions because, well, I guess I have to. God's in control. He'll zap me if I don't do certain things. And so you'll do your bit. You're not drawing close to God. You're not getting anything out of it. The best Christians the best disciples these are people who realize that God loves them. God really loves them. God really cares for them in exactly the same way that you and I easily picture Jesus in that role. That's a God you can draw close to. That's a God you can draw strength from when you're having a rough day in the midst of all this lockdown and all the pandemic and bad news, perhaps, especially personal bad news. A God who loves you, that's the God you can go to and say, I need your help, as opposed to trying to figure out what it was you did in the past that finally came back to roost. Let's learn a little theology. Let's learn about Jesus.